Let me share with you another feature and another default behavior as well that Nmap does. When you do an Nmap scan, Nmap will report the service running behind the port based on the port number. Meaning, let's say Nmap found 3 open ports, port 21, port 22, and port 80. By default, what are these port numbers associated with? Port 21 is usually associated with FTP, port 22 is for SSH, and port 80 is for web. So what Nmap will do by default is that it will report these services to be running on these ports purely based on the port number. This is the default behavior of Nmap. However, sometimes you might come across the system that has been configured out of the norm or out of the default. So for example, you might come across a system where you have a web server that is not running on port 80. It could be on port 8080 or port 8888, for example. And in that case, what will happen is that Nmap will mistakenly report the service to be something else. And again, this is because it's reporting it purely based on the port number. So how do we work around this? We do something called service scan. When we tell Nmap to do a service scan, we're asking Nmap to do further investigation about the service running behind a port. So Nmap no longer relies only on the port number to determine what the service is, but instead it will go ahead and try to communicate and negotiate with that port and see what kind of response it will get back. Quite similar actually to what you've done already using Netcat. So imagine this. Imagine that Nmap on your behalf will actually go ahead and communicate with port 80 and test whether it actually will understand HTTP or not. If not, it will try something else. Maybe it will try to talk to it with FTP language. Maybe it will try to talk to it with the DNS language. And based on the response and what the service actually understands, Nmap will report it back to you as what it actually is. Let me show you what that looks like. First, I'm going to make sure that my Apache service is started. And I can double check by running the service Apache 2 status. And as you can see here, it looks like it's running. So this is good. And I'm going to do Nmap on localhost. I'm scanning my own Kali host. That will finish fairly quickly, and you can see that I have 2 ports open, port 22 and port 80. Now Nmap reports the services to be SSH and HTTP. And again, this is purely based on the port numbers that are open. As we already know, port 22 is usually for SSH, port 80 is usually for HTTP. Let me see if we can trick Nmap. I'm going to go ahead and change the configuration of Apache so it will run on a different port number. And to do that, I'm going to change the configuration file under /etc/apache2/ports.conf. And here, as you can see, is the port number that Apache will be listening to by default. Right now it's set on port 80, which is the standard web port. I'm going to go ahead and change it to port 21. I'll save this, and I need to make sure that I restart the Apache service. So let me do that. And now let me try and run Nmap again. So I'm going to do Nmap localhost. Now again, Nmap finds 2 ports open. However, this time it's port 21 and port 22. And notice that Nmap now is reporting port 21 to have the FTP service running on it. You and I, we both know that this is incorrect because we just configured Apache to run on port 21. So we know the service is actually Apache, it's a web service. It is not an FTP service. However, Nmap assumes it's FTP because it sees it running on port 21. So this is the default behavior. How do we work around this? We use the service scan. So we ask Nmap to go ahead and actually double check and verify what the service is running by communicating with that service and trying to actually initiate a dialogue and double check and verify what the service is. And to do this, we use the Nmap -SV option. Notice that the previous scans finished in a fraction of a second. This scan, however, comparatively is going to take considerably longer. However, look at the result. It comes back with a very precise, accurate result. And it tells you that on port 21, as a matter of fact, it's not FTP. However, it's Apache with a specific version of the Apache server running. Same thing for port 22, where we have the OpenSSH service running. I hope this clarifies the difference. So as a best practice, you want to always run the service scan on the ports that you find open. Don't rely just on the port number. And it's not just because you want to see what kind of service is running and verify it, but it also helps you determine the exact version of the service running. And this is going to come in quite handy in later stages when we're going to be researching vulnerabilities and exploits that we want to use against our target system. Alright, if you're following along, please remember to go ahead and revert back all the changes. So let's actually do that. I'm going to edit the ports.conf file again. I'm going to change port 21 to port 80. I'll save it and I'll restart the Apache service. And just as an extra measure, let me go and double check, make sure that the service is running. I'll refresh the page. All is good. Fantastic. When you're ready, let's move on to the next section.